Her hands were steady, at least on the outside. Every step she took down that narrow hallway felt heavier, as though the air itself had thickened to hold her back. She could hear the faint rustle of fabric behind the door, the sound of movement that didn't belong there. The voices were hushed, quick, like they were hiding from the world. But the world had already found them. Her eyes locked on the handle. It was old brass, polished in the center from years of turning, yet cool against her palm now. Far too cool for a day meant to be warm with love. She leaned closer. A laugh, faint and sharp, slipped through the gap under the door. She knew that laugh. For a moment she stood there, suspended between two versions of her life, the one she thought she had, and the one waiting for her on the other side of that door. A heartbeat, then another. Her own breathing drowned out the rest of the world. She could hear the threads of her gown brushing the floor, the muted thud of her pulse in her ears. Slowly, the door gave way, its hinges crying out in a long, reluctant groan. Light spilled out, dim, golden, and trembling, and there they were, the man she had promised her life to, and the one person she had trusted above all others, locked together in a way that shattered the very meaning of sacred. Her voice didn't come. Her throat was tight, but her silence spoke louder than any accusation could. In that moment, the air between them became a wall, cold, unbreakable, and final. The kind of wall you don't climb, you bring down. Where are you watching this from? And if you believe betrayal like this should never be hidden, hit share right now. If you won't, go to the comments and tell me why you'd keep this a secret. She didn't turn away, not yet. Instead, she stepped back from the doorway, her movements quiet, deliberate, as though even the air was being held hostage. Their laughter had stopped the instant she appeared, replaced by a silence so heavy it pressed against her ears. She closed the door, softly, carefully, as if to seal that moment inside, away from the eyes of the waiting guests. The corridor beyond felt longer now, the walls taller, closing in with every step. The polished floor reflected her gown in perfect detail, flawless white, untouched by the truth she now carried. She returned to the hall, where music floated lazily through the air. Faces turned toward her, smiling, expecting nothing more than a bride's glow. And she gave it to them, a curve of the lips that told them nothing, yet held everything. But behind that practiced smile, her mind was pulling at threads. The glances she had ignored, the sudden quiet pauses in conversation when she entered a room, the way his hand had rested a fraction too long on someone else's shoulder. Little things, once harmless, now lined up like a trail she had refused to follow. She saw it clearly now. The dinners where they would sit across from her, trading glances she pretended not to notice. The shared jokes that ended abruptly when her voice joined the room. Even the way their phones seemed to vanish from sight whenever she was near. They had been careful, almost perfect. Almost. And she had been willing to believe them, because believing them was easier than believing the truth. Now every memory was shifting in her mind, colors bleeding into one another, moments warping until she could no longer tell if they had ever been real. She thought of the time she caught them in the kitchen long after the others had gone to bed, their conversation ending in a silence so loaded it almost hummed. She had dismissed it then, laughing to herself about her own overactive imagination. But this was no imagination. In the crowd, her eyes searched for them, expecting to see guilt etched into their faces. Yet there they stood, separate, calm, speaking to different people as if nothing had happened. If she hadn't seen them herself, she would have thought she had dreamed it. That was their strength. They could look her in the eye and carry the weight of a lie without a single tremor in their voice. A server passed by with a tray of champagne. She took a glass, more to steady her hands than to drink. The bubbles rose and fell, each one popping in silence, a perfect reflection of her day so far, glittering on the surface, hollow underneath. Somewhere in the distance, the church bells sounded, slow and measured, calling her toward the moment everyone had been waiting for, The aisle, the vows, the promise, all now wrapped in a truth she could not speak. Not yet. She had a choice. End it now, before the ceremony, or carry the weight of what she knew until the right moment, the moment that would make it impossible for either of them to recover. Her eyes lingered on the doors at the far end of the hall. Beyond them lay the path to the altar. But also, somewhere unseen, the path back to that room, that door, that sight she could never unsee. And the longer she stood there, the more certain she became. There would be no quiet ending to this story. When she was ready, they would hear her truth. And when they did, it would echo louder than the bells outside. Tell me, where are you watching this from right now? And share this if you've ever seen signs like these. If you won't, explain why in the comments. What are you hiding? The morning had begun with light spilling through lace curtains, scattering soft patterns across the room. Her dress hung against the wall like a silent witness, its folds catching every flicker of gold from the rising sun. By the time the first guests arrived, the air outside was warm, the kind of warmth that should have felt comforting. Inside, though, each moment stretched like a held breath. She moved among the crowd with the grace expected of her, but her eyes were always searching. Every time she turned, she noticed the same thing. The groom was nowhere to be seen. Whispers carried through the corridors, too faint to understand, but too sharp to ignore. Whenever she tried to follow them, the voices would vanish, leaving only the soft shuffle of shoes on the polished floor. The maid of honor avoided her gaze entirely. Once, when their paths crossed near the entrance, the woman's smile faltered just enough to betray the strain beneath it. She clutched her bouquet a little too tightly, the stems bending under her grip. At the far end of the hall, the priest should have been preparing. Instead, his absence left a gap in the flow of the day, a space no one acknowledged, yet everyone seemed to sense. The altar stood ready, candles unlit, their wicks black from earlier rehearsals. She passed a mirror on the way to her dressing room and caught her own reflection, the veil framing her face, the jewels at her ears, the faint trace of blush on her cheeks. It was the image of a bride the world expected. But behind her eyes, the weight of what she had seen pressed harder with each passing second. She sat alone for a moment, gown spread around her like a frozen wave. The music outside rose and fell, strings and keys weaving through the murmurs of conversation. From somewhere beyond the walls, a door shut firmly. Footsteps followed. 2 sets, quick, then slower, as if adjusting their pace. She didn't move. Her ears caught every sound, piecing them together into a story she already knew too well. When her maid of honor returned to fetch her, she could feel the hesitation in the woman's hand as it rested on her arm. They walked side by side toward the waiting guests, the aisle, the promise she no longer believed in. At the threshold, the doors remained closed, guards of wood and brass holding back the moment. She looked at them, knowing that once they opened, every step forward would be a step deeper into a truth she had no intention of burying forever. Somewhere behind her, the groom's voice carried low, speaking to someone she could not see. It wasn't the words that caught her attention, it was the tone, familiar, careful, the same voice she had heard in that room. Her heart didn't race. Instead, it slowed, steadying itself for what she knew was coming. Because ceremonies begin with smiles, but endings can arrive dressed in silence. Where are you watching this from? And if you'd warn someone before they walk into a day like this, hit share. If you wouldn't, go to the comments and tell me your reason. The music had softened, fading into the background until it was nothing more than a distant hum. She stood at the side of the hall just beyond the reach of the guests' eyes. Somewhere nearby, laughter drifted faintly through the air, muffled, hesitant, but real. It wasn't the laughter of celebration. It was private, unmeant for her. Her gaze followed the sound, tracing it past the flower arrangements and along the corridor that led toward the old vestry. That corridor was narrow, lined with portraits of priests whose eyes seemed to follow her as she walked. The polished floor echoed her footsteps, each one falling heavier than the last. Halfway down, she slowed. The laughter had stopped. In its place, a low murmur, two voices close together, speaking words too quiet to catch. She reached the vestry door. The wood was aged, the grain running deep, the handle worn smooth by decades of use. Her fingers hovered over it, her pulse steady now, almost unnaturally so. She leaned in, catching fragments of their breath between sentences, the closeness of it, the familiarity. She pressed her ear to the door. For a long moment, there was nothing. Then came the sound, the faint, unmistakable shift of fabric, the weight of movement shared between two people who knew they were alone. She tried the handle. It resisted, locked. For a moment she simply stood there, her palm resting on the brass. Her reflection stared back from its dull shine, pale, still, and certain. She could have left then, could have turned back, allowed the ceremony to carry on, the smiles and applause to wash over the truth. But her hand tightened. A key rattled faintly from the inside. The voices paused. She stepped back just enough for the door to swing open, its hinges protesting in a long, reluctant groan. The room beyond was dim, lit only by a small lamp on the far table. Shadows clung to the corners, and in the center of it, two figures, too close, faces flushed, startled not by the sight of each other, but by the sight of her, the groom. His collar loosened, his expression caught between shock and defiance. And beside him, the maid of honor, her hair slightly disheveled, bouquet abandoned on a chair. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. The truth was already standing between them, solid and immovable. She held their gaze, one after the other, for what felt like an eternity. No raised voice, no accusations, only the kind of silence that carries its own weight, heavy enough to crush whatever lies they might have been ready to tell. Then, without a word, she stepped back, letting the door fall shut. The latch clicked into place, and just like that, they were alone again. But this time, it was no longer their secret. It was hers, and she had no intention of letting it fade quietly into the background of her wedding day. Where are you watching from? And if you think you could face a truth like this, share this now. If you wouldn't, go to the comments and tell me why. She walked back into the main hall, each step measured, each breath drawn with care. The murmur of conversation wrapped around her like a veil, but beneath it she heard the faint echoes of what she had just left behind. The bouquet was still in her hand, its stems damp and cool against her palm. She looked at it for only a moment before letting it slip. It landed softly on the carpet, petals scattering in a loose arc. A guest bent to retrieve it, but she was already walking away. Heads turned as she passed. She felt their eyes, their curiosity brushing against her like a hand she didn't want. Some smiled as if to reassure her. Others whispered, their voices dipping low when they thought she was out of earshot. The music continued, violins tracing delicate patterns through the air, each note falling into the space between her thoughts. She stood near the back of the hall, out of the light, watching as the guests moved and laughed and waited for the ceremony to begin. Across the room, the groom had returned, his posture easy, his expression carefully arranged into something warm. Beside him, the maid of honor moved with the same careful precision. Their eyes never sought hers. That alone told her everything she needed to know. She stayed there, still, letting the distance between them grow. She didn't need to confront them now. Not here. The truth had already rooted itself in the soil of this day, and it would bloom. She would make sure of it. A young cousin approached her, tugging at her gown to ask why the ceremony was taking so long. She smiled, bending down to say something soft enough that no one else could hear. Whatever she said made the child look back toward the groom with wide eyes before hurrying away. At the far end, a group of older guests leaned together, speaking in voices that carried just enough for others to notice. The air in the hall was changing, subtly, but undeniably. The easy laughter was thinning. The conversations were breaking into shorter, sharper exchanges. She took a glass from a passing tray and moved toward the side exit, slipping out into the corridor where the light was dim and the walls pressed closer. Alone again, she allowed her shoulders to drop, the weight of the moment settling into her bones. Some wounds do not scream. They bleed quietly, leaving no visible mark until it's too late to stop them. She could feel the wound now, deep and certain, and she knew it would never heal the same way. She had no plan yet, no script for what would happen next. But she knew one thing with absolute clarity. This day would not end the way they expected. And when it was over, the memory of her silence would be the thing that haunted them most. Where are you watching this from? And if you'd forgive, say it in the comments. If you'd burn it all down, say revenge. If you can't choose, tell me why. The hall had grown restless. Guests shifted in their seats, glancing at watches, exchanging low remarks about the delay. Somewhere the priest had appeared, his robe hanging in careful folds, but his eyes carried the kind of unease that could not be hidden. The groom stood at the altar, hands clasped loosely in front of him, smiling in a way that didn't quite reach his eyes. The maid of honor lingered near the front row, bouquet in hand once more, though the petals now looked faintly bruised. Then the church doors closed, firmly. Minutes passed. The murmurs thickened, and when the doors opened again, the room fell silent. She stepped through, no longer in white. The gown she wore now was deep red, a color that caught the light like flame and shadow in the same breath. It moved around her ankles with every measured step, the fabric whispering against the stone floor. Her veil was gone. In its place, her hair framed her face, unhidden, her eyes locked on the man waiting at the altar. The guests leaned forward, drawn toward her without understanding why. She didn't rush. Every step down the aisle was deliberate, the click of her shoes marking the distance between who she had been that morning and who she was now. When she reached the front, she stopped, standing not at his side, but facing him, a space between them wide enough to hold the truth. The groom's smile faltered. She spoke no words to him. Instead, she turned slowly to face the guests. Her gaze swept the room, meeting eyes, holding them, letting each person feel the weight of her presence. Then she stepped aside, just enough for their view to shift and settle on the maid of honor. Whispers broke out instantly, the kind that ripple through a crowd and grow heavier with each repetition. Someone gasped. Another guest looked sharply between the two of them, the pieces clicking into place without a single explanation. The maid of honor's face stiffened. Her fingers gripped the bouquet until petals began to fall to the floor. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The silence she had carried all day had become something sharper, something that cut clean through the air. She simply stood there, in her red dress, the image of the vow that would never be spoken, and let the truth reveal itself in the eyes of everyone present. No one moved to start the ceremony. No one dared to speak. The altar, once meant for a union, now stood between them as a barrier, cold, unyielding, final. She turned then, walking the aisle once more, this time with her head high and her hands free. The doors closed behind her, the echo ringing through the hall like the last word of a sentence no one wanted to finish. And in the space she left behind, regret settled over them like a shadow that would never lift. Where are you watching from? And if you think more people should see how betrayal is answered, hit share. If you wouldn't, tell me why in the comments. The reception hall, once alive with laughter and clinking glasses, now lay under a heavy blanket of silence. The guests had long since left, their hurried footsteps echoing faintly in the bride's memory. What remained was the low hum of an air conditioner, the faint ticking of a clock in the corner, and the lingering perfume of flowers that had begun to wilt. Amara sat alone at a table meant for 12, her fingers tracing the edge of a plate she hadn't touched. A half-full wine glass glimmered beside her, but she could not bring herself to drink. Each sip would taste like a toast to a memory that had already died. Somewhere in the distance, the faint shuffle of shoes could be heard, deliberate, slow, and unhurried. It wasn't the confident stride of a guest or the hurried pace of a waiter. It was something different, as though each step was measured, calculated. Her eyes shifted toward the doorway. Nothing, just the dim outline of the corridor beyond, shadows stretching across the floor like fingers reaching into the hall. But the sound persisted. A step, pause, another step. Then the voice came, soft at first, almost fragile, as if afraid of its own echo. "You shouldn't be here alone, Amara." She froze. It wasn't Tunde. It wasn't her mother. It wasn't anyone she recognized from the wedding. The air thickened. She turned her head slowly, and there, just beyond the spill of dim light, stood a man in a dark suit, his face obscured by shadow. No smile, no expression, just a stillness that unsettled her more than if he had been shouting. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. The man tilted his head slightly, as though her question was irrelevant. He stepped forward into the light, and something about him felt out of place. Not because of his attire, many had worn suits today, but because his eyes seemed to hold a knowledge she couldn't understand. "You saw more than you should have today," he said, his tone calm but laced with something unspoken. "And that will have consequences." Her breath caught. Before she could respond, he slid something across the table toward her. It was small, metallic, and cold to the touch. A key. No explanation, no note. Just the weight of it sitting in her palm. When she looked up again, he was already walking away, his silhouette shrinking until it dissolved into the shadows. The sound of his footsteps faded, but the heaviness of his words did not. The hall felt colder now. The wine glass shimmered in the dim light, untouched. And Amara understood. This night was far from over. Amara's fingers tightened around the key until the sharp ridges bit into her skin. It was small, brass, worn at the edges, like it had passed through many hands before hers. There was no tag, no number, nothing to hint at what it might unlock. She set it on the table and stared at it, as though sheer willpower could force an answer to surface. But all she felt was the weight of the man's words echoing in her mind. "You saw more than you should have today, and that will have consequences." Her instinct screamed to throw it away. Pretend none of it happened. Forget the man, forget the key, forget the images that had been burned into her memory earlier that day. But deep down, she knew she wouldn't. Something about that encounter felt deliberate, like the key wasn't just a warning, it was an invitation. The hall's dim lights flickered, the shadows stretching and twisting across the floor. Somewhere outside, a car door slammed. Amara's pulse quickened. She rose, her chair scraping softly against the tile, and slipped the key into her purse. The cool metal seemed to radiate against her side as she walked toward the exit. Outside, the parking lot was deserted except for her car. The street beyond was empty, but she couldn't shake the sensation that someone, somewhere, was watching. The drive home was a blur. Streetlights flashed across her windshield in rhythmic intervals, each one briefly illuminating her hands, gripping the steering wheel tighter than necessary. When she reached her apartment, the world outside seemed unnervingly still. She locked the door behind her and leaned against it, letting the silence settle. But it wasn't the comforting kind of silence. It was the kind that felt expectant. She set her purse on the counter, her eyes falling on the faint bulge where the key lay hidden. Slowly, she drew it out, holding it beneath the glow of her kitchen light. That's when she noticed it. Engraved into the side of the key, so faint it was almost invisible, was a series of numbers. Not a room number, not a date, but coordinates. Her chest tightened. She didn't know the location, but she knew this. Whatever those numbers led to, it was connected to the man in the dark suit. And it was connected to what she saw earlier that day behind the altar. For a long time, she stood frozen. Then, She reached for her phone, because something inside her told her, once she started following those coordinates, there would be no way back. The screen glowed in the dimness of her apartment as Amara typed the coordinates into her phone. The map shifted, zoomed, and finally settled on a small, unnamed patch of land just outside the city, an area she didn't recognize. It was off the main road, surrounded by thick woodland, and from the satellite view, there was nothing but trees and a narrow dirt path winding into darkness. No buildings, no streetlights, just isolation. Her thumb hovered over the screen. Logic told her to delete the entry, throw the key away, and go to bed. But logic had been losing the fight all night. Curiosity had her by the throat. Minutes later, she was back in her car. The night air was heavy, the sky moonless, the city lights fading behind her as the road stretched into shadows. The further she drove, the narrower the streets became, until her headlights cut through pure blackness on either side. The navigation voice instructed her to turn left, but when she did, the asphalt gave way to gravel. Stones crunched under her tires, and the dense trees closed in around her, their skeletal branches clawing toward the car. Finally, the GPS announced she had arrived at her destination. She cut the engine. Silence. When she stepped out, the chill in the air hit her instantly. The only sound was the faint whisper of wind through the leaves. The dirt path stretched ahead, disappearing into the woods. She followed it, her phone's flashlight casting a narrow beam. The ground was uneven, the air damp with the scent of moss and earth. Her every step seemed to echo too loudly. Then, she saw it. At the end of the path stood an old iron gate. Rust streaked its bars, and a heavy chain looped through the lock. The gate was set into a crumbling stone wall, moss climbing its surface like veins. Her pulse quickened as she reached into her pocket and pulled out the brass key. The chain's lock was ancient, the kind with a large keyhole. Her hands trembled as she slid the key in. It turned. The chain dropped to the ground with a metallic thud that seemed to ripple through the night. She pushed the gate open. It groaned loudly, the sound slicing through the silence. Beyond the gate was a narrow clearing, and in the center of it, something unexpected. A small, weathered chapel. Its wooden door was slightly ajar. A faint, flickering light glowed from within, and from inside came the soft, unmistakable sound of someone whispering her name. Amara froze at the threshold, her breath caught halfway in her chest. The sound of her name wasn't just a whisper. It was intimate, as though whoever spoke it knew her far too well. The door creaked wider on its own, nudged by a draft that seemed to come from nowhere. The glow inside was dim, flickering unevenly, like candlelight trembling in a restless air. Her shoes barely made a sound on the old stone floor as she stepped inside. The scent hit her first: wax, damp wood, and something metallic beneath it, sharp and faintly sweet, like rust or blood. Rows of worn pews stretched before her, each draped in a thin veil of dust. At the far end, the altar stood cloaked in shadow. A single candle burned there, its light dancing across the cracked wall. Amara! She whipped around. No one. The voice was closer this time, too close, yet there was no body, no movement in the stillness. Her skin prickled. She forced herself forward, her eyes catching on something strange. On the front pew, a leather-bound book lay open, its pages curling at the edges. She leaned in. The text wasn't in English, or any language she recognized. Symbols looped and spiraled across the paper, some so intricate they almost looked alive. She turned the page, and her breath stopped. There, sketched in the center, was her own face. Not a photograph, an illustration. The likeness was perfect, down to the smallest detail. The faint scar above her left eyebrow, the mole just under her jawline. Her hand hovered over the page, but before she could touch it, the candle on the altar went out. Darkness swallowed the chapel. And then, from somewhere beyond the altar, the sound of slow, deliberate footsteps began to echo. each one closing the distance between her and whatever had been waiting in the dark. The footsteps were heavy, measured, and far too calm for someone stumbling in the dark. Each strike against the stone floor seemed to match the rhythm of her own heart, forcing it to beat faster, harder, until it almost hurt. Amara's eyes strained against the blackness, her fingers brushing over the pew for balance. The air was thicker now, warmer, carrying with it a faint scent of incense that hadn't been there before. Another step. Closer. Her voice caught in her throat, the words she wanted to call out tangled somewhere between fear and defiance. A low scrape echoed from the altar, wood dragging across stone. The sound was deliberate, unhurried, as though whoever was there wanted her to hear it. And then, silence. No movement, no breathing, just an oppressive stillness that pressed down on her chest until she could barely inhale. She turned toward the faint outline of the altar, her hands trembling as she tried to adjust to the dark. That's when she saw it. 2 points of light no bigger than coins hovering at eye level. They weren't reflections. They weren't flickers from the candle's dying flame. They were watching her. She took one slow step back. The lights moved forward in perfect sync. Another step. They followed. Her heel hit the edge of the pew behind her, sending a loud crack through the chapel. And in that exact instant, the points of light blinked, once, and then vanished completely. For a moment she thought it was over, that whatever it was had gone. But then, from just inches away, a voice whispered, soft, steady, and unmistakably human. "You shouldn't have come here, Amara." Her breath stopped. The voice was close enough for her to feel the faint warmth of it against her ear. Every instinct told her to run, but her body refused to move. "Who are you?" she managed to whisper. No reply. A faint shuffling sound, leather on stone, circled her slowly, each step deliberate, as if measuring her fear. She tried to turn, but something unseen gripped her wrist with a force that sent a sharp jolt of pain up her arm. "You've seen what you were never meant to see," the voice continued, calm yet edged with something she could not name. "If you speak of it, there will be consequences." The grip tightened. "You think you know the truth," it said, "but there's more, much more, and if you value the lives of those you love, you'll forget you were ever here." Amara's pulse thrashed in her ears. She wanted to ask, "What did I see? What truth?" But the words lodged in her throat. The voice leaned in, barely audible now. "They're already watching you." And then, just as suddenly as it had come, the presence was gone. Her wrist was free. The chapel was silent again, empty. The single candle near the altar flickered once, then went out, plunging the room into absolute darkness. Somewhere far off, the sound of a door creaking open reached her ears, followed by the faintest hint of footsteps fading into the distance. She stood frozen for what felt like hours, unsure if it was safe to breathe, let alone move. When she finally stepped outside, the cold night air stung her skin, but it wasn't relief she felt. It was the heavy, unshakable certainty that her life had just changed forever, and that whatever had happened inside that chapel was only the beginning. Because in the silence behind her, deep within the darkness she had just escaped, came a sound she knew she would hear again, a slow, deliberate footstep. On the polished surface, where moments ago there had been nothing, now lies a folded piece of parchment. No hand placed it there, no shadow moved. It simply exists, silent, waiting. The candle that had gone out now burns again, its flame unnaturally steady despite the draft seeping through the old stone cracks. Its light falls on the parchment, revealing the faint outline of a symbol burned into the wax seal, a circle intersected by a single vertical line. The door at the far end of the chapel swings shut on its own. The echo of the impact travels unnaturally slowly, as though sound itself is reluctant to disturb what lies within. Then, faint but distinct, comes the sound of breathing. Not from any corner of the room, but from everywhere. It grows, layer upon layer, dozens of breaths overlapping, as though the chapel is no longer empty, but filled. Filled with unseen witnesses who have been there all along. One breath rises above the rest, a deep, calm inhale, followed by a whisper that is almost gentle. She will return. The candlelight shivers violently. The parchment slides forward on its own, stopping just at the edge of the altar, as if urging to be opened. Then the flame extinguishes. Everything vanishes into black. Somewhere in that darkness a footstep echoes, slow, deliberate, and unmistakable.